Hi everybody, Adrian Fontes here. Did you know that the Democrats of Greater Tucson has a website, thedgt.org, and if you subscribe, it's only 20 bucks. You can support this great weekly communication where folks get together. Sometimes there's candidates, sometimes folks like me pop on to help understand what's going on in the world. The Democrats of Greater Tucson, thedgt.org. Join up today.
So I've been with the city for about 6 years. When I started at the city, I was a contract worker for about a year, and then I went to the zoning team for about 4 years, and then the last half year or so, I've been here on the long-range planning team, where we've been working on code updates, particularly in the kind of flavor of the year has been the community corridors tool, but we're also working on a couple other things like some of the state housing bills that are going through currently, like middle housing, where we're going to be looking at legalizing more ADUs in more areas around the city from a state mandate. So I'll just jump right into it. So you all asked me to come talk about the community corridors tool from the city of Tucson perspective. So the community corridors tool really came about because it really fits a lot of the goals that, like I was saying, that the mayor and the city council have been talking about for years. So some of the things that we've been seeing nationally as well in terms of barriers to attainable housing, we seek to address attainable housing and affordable housing, kind of affordable housing being capital A, affordable housing, meaning subsidized government affordable housing, but also attainable housing. And I'll get into some of the numbers and the figures with what we're talking about with that. Also looking to promote transit-oriented infill development that supports the city's climate action goals. So this was built off of years and years of different goals that have been implemented by the city. And so we started doing this about 2 or 3 years ago, the public outreach, but really this has been something that over the past couple of decades, the city has been seeking to improve on, just based off some of the goals that have been passed by the mayor and council, by some of the functional plans in the city of Tucson. And so we really wanted to develop a tool that supported our climate action goals. Some of this came along because of rising housing costs. This is something that is not just affecting Tucson, but it's a pretty big national issue at the moment. So what we did was we worked in conjunction with a couple of different partners. So one was Eco Northwest that did a housing study for us. And what they found was really interesting, and it really matched up with the PEMA associate of the PAG data that we've also seen. So right now, just as a baseline in 2025, there's a homelessness need of nearly 5,000 units, which is about 13% of the needed units in the city of Tucson. Mix that with some underproduction of housing to reach a certain point where rents start decreasing of 8,000 units needed. And then talking about a future need over the next 10 or so years of 22,000 units, we're about short 35,000 units of housing in the city of Tucson. What happens is you see in those middle affordability areas right here in the middle, you're seeing a lot of people come from out of state buying some of those up. They might have more purchasing power than the average Tucsonan. They can take a property, they can fix it up, and they can build it to a higher standard. And so what happens when you underproduce housing like the city of Tucson has been underproducing is you get that need on kind of both ends of it, where you really need some of that high income housing for people moving here that have more purchasing power to buy, because otherwise, if they don't end up buying it, they're going to go to that next step down and buy that. So people that have that average median income are not able to get that. And so it just becomes kind of a cascading effect there. So let's talk about the community corridors tool overview, some of the applicability. So this is meant to be on a scale of properties that are along a corridor, and that's based off of our major streets and routes plan. That's any major street and route in the city of Tucson. So think Speedway, think Grant, think Broadway, even North and South, Swan, First. And then some of those, anything designated as an arterial or as a collector street. So even things like Mountain or Pima, some of those smaller major streets and routes. It's designed so it increases housing production in the R2, R3, and R1, but to a minimal extent, but mostly our office and commercial zones, our OCR, office, commercial, and residential zones. So the permitted uses are what's allowed already in our underlying zoning. So if you go along, let's just say you're going along Speedway, you can already do multifamily housing along Speedway. And you can already do a lot of different things like coffee shops, bars, etc. So we're not changing a lot of the permitted uses, but we are encouraging people to do non-car dependent uses. So the corridors tool excludes things like car washes, it excludes drive-throughs, and it excludes storage container or storage units. So you can still build those things along the corridor, but if you're going to opt into the community corridors tool and take advantage of some of the benefits of it, you cannot do some of those more auto-centric uses. So a lot of the big things that we're changing are the dimensional standards. We're allowing a little bit more height, some more density, and we're changing a little bit of the parking calculations so that we can see more housing being built. Think about the sites like the Elcon Mall. Think about sites like some of these strip malls where they're underutilized sites. There's a sea of parking that's rarely used, and then there's a building setback pretty far. Anyone can still go and build there and do that type of development. But now with the community corridors tool, we're incentivizing people to build something a little bit more walk-friendly, bike-friendly, transit-friendly, something that gives you a better urban design than we've been seeing along our corridors. So the incentives and bonuses we're using, we're allowing more height. We're giving people a benefit to building affordable housing. Right now, because of state statute, the city of Tucson cannot require any sort of affordable housing being built anywhere. So the next best thing for us to do is to incentivize it. So the community corridors tool incentivizes affordable housing by allowing extra height for building that affordable housing. And we're also incentivizing building commercial ground uses that are more pedestrian and community oriented, things that people want to see. Rather than seeing 4 Starbucks on an intersection that is a drive-through only, there are other things that benefit the community to a much greater extent than that. And then flexibility in our design standard, our development standards, allowing greater flexibility in how parking is calculated, while still requiring master plans for large sites. So think of Elcon Mall and Park Place Mall. If someone were to redevelop that, they would need to provide us a master plan, and I can talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about where this tool applies. This, like I said, is an optional tool. You can still do the same development that you could do last month in the city of Tucson. But if you're going to opt in and get some of the benefit that I've been talking about, you have to do a few certain things. So this is an optional tool. The site is required to have frontage along a major street and route transportation corridor. So if you look at the example over here, saying that this is a corridor running east and west or a corridor running north and south, only those zoned commercially are allowed to utilize this tool along here. There's a couple other scenarios in which you could do an R2, like if they're vacant or if they're sandwiched between a site. So look at the north, let's see, I'd say the northeast corner here, there's an R2 in between the C1 and O1 zone. You would be able to utilize that because it's sandwiched between 2 commercial zones, and it's kind of zoned R2 a little bit arbitrarily there. So there are certain qualifications for using this tool. R1 and R2 zones can use it. They have to be sandwiched, like I talked about. They have to be vacant as of the adoption of this code, which was last week. So you can't just go in and demolish an old home that was an R1 or an R2 and then utilize the CCT. It was not designed for that. Or it can be a part of a larger site that has mixed zoning. So if you look kind of at the right side of this graphic, you see some C1 fronting, but there's some R2 behind it that would not have been eligible to be utilized in under our current zoning. So kind of the example there, let's say somebody wanted to build an apartment on a C1 zone. They would not be able to put any of their amenities in that R2 zone if it weren't allowed with the underlying zoning. So right now, or as of a month ago, you wouldn't have been able to utilize any of that R2 part of the site for parking or say community amenities because it wasn't zoned for that. Now you can kind of combine those and you can put extra things as extra parts of your development in that R2 part, like the parking, like community amenities. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility to use some of those zones that were kind of arbitrary in those areas. I do want to point out that this does not work in existing overlays. So historic preservation zones, you cannot utilize the community corridors tool. Historic landmarks, you cannot utilize it. Urban overlay zones, neighborhood preservation zones, so NPZ, think like some of those, Jefferson Park, you could not do it in the Jefferson Park neighborhood. Neighborhood preservation zones, downtown infill incentive district, just because that's a totally different area and has already been studied and gone through mayor and council approval in years past. And then planned area developments are ineligible to use the community corridors tool as well. So let's talk about some of the dimensional standards that you're going to get some relief from with the community corridors tool. Let's take an example of the C1 zone over here. So before, about a month ago, you could only go to about 30 feet in non-residential use height. So 30 feet with modern building code really only gives you 2 stories. That does not incentivize a lot of affordable housing or any housing really to be built. When we reached out to the community, particularly the development community, what they're finding is the only projects right now that are penciling, that are really making financial sense for them to build, are those 4 to 6 story apartment complexes or smaller single family development that you're seeing kind of on the outskirts of town, southeast side mostly. So really, you're not finding a lot of that middle housing that we're missing. So you're seeing a lot of the really big apartment complexes, and then some of the single family residential. But the things that are penciling, and we need developers to build, are that 4 to 6 story range of apartment buildings that make financial sense. So part of this was developed to allow that to be built. Under our current zoning, the C1 is a pretty ubiquitous zone in the city of Tucson, along with the R1. Those were not allowing much height. And so we're not seeing housing production because our zoning code does not allow it to be built that way. So right now you could do 50 feet in building height along a C1 corridor when you could only do 30 before, giving you a comfortable 4 stories there. If you opt in and do affordable housing, or you do one of our other options like ground floor retail, that in for a use that is something that people want to use, like laundry facilities or a market or grocery store, coffee shop, then we give you another foot of height as well. So you can get up to 62 feet if you're doing a community benefit. So that's kind of the trade-off here. And it gives you another story. So there's 2 things you can do. You can opt into the community corridors tool. You can get this height, this 50 feet in the C1, or you could opt in to a second tier of it and get another story if you're doing the affordable housing or something that gives you a community benefit. So we could go through zone by zone, and I know we'll have some time after this if you have any questions, but this is just an example of the C1, giving you a lot more height, and also getting to that point where projects that are going to provide the most housing are going to pencil for developers, which is just one of the big reasons why we're not seeing housing built, which is why we're 30,000 some odd units in the hole right now in Tucson when it comes to housing under production. So when we took this to the public, we knew that there was going to be some pushback about infringing on the neighborhoods, encroaching into the neighborhoods. And so we built this with a step back system. So the idea is that there's a minimum front street or a maximum front street setback that you'll have to meet. So we want essentially the brunt of the building to be on the corridor where there's already transportation, where people are driving, and for you to step your projects back once you get closer to the neighborhoods. This is a part of the neighborhood protections that when it comes to privacy mitigation that we built into here, saying like you can get pretty high along these corridors, but we want you to step back so that you're not encroaching into the neighborhoods, so that there's privacy mitigation, so that there's a separation. This is one of those gives and takes that we took when we reached out to the neighborhood, something that they asked for, something that mayor and council asked for to protect the view sheds. I'll give you an example of how this is going to work and something that's already happening right now. So this is a real example. This is the Amazon Flats Motel site. This is on Miracle Mile. They, with their underlying zoning, and that was their current zoning right now, that did not change. They have a C2 and a mobile home 1 mixed zone property. How that happened, I don't really know, but this happens a lot of the time in Tucson, where you have some underutilized sites where they're trying to build affordable housing. They could do 60 units of affordable housing a month ago, before the community corridors tool was adopted. They could go 40 feet in height. And then in that mobile home 1 zone, they could do almost nothing in terms of what they were allowed to do back behind this site. So right now with the community corridors tool, you can get up to 124 units. They could do 94. They're proposing 94, but they can get up to 124. They could do 60 feet in building height, mostly along the corridor, so not behind in the neighborhood. And they're able to do a little bit more in that mobile home 1 zone that they wouldn't have been able to do. So this is a really good example of them tripling the number of units that are going to be that capital A affordable than they would have been able to do a month ago. So, and we're seeing this is going to be a tool that's going to be utilized by the Housing Community Development Department quite a bit, because this really gives them the chance to up the number of units that they're building. So this is a really big tool for affordable housing, even though we cannot require anybody to build affordable housing. So there's and getting into a little bit more of the process of this when somebody comes in for their development. We realize this is not a one-size-fits-all tool. There's always an exception. So properties which do not meet the preceding criteria but are adjacent to a CCT eligible property, they can opt for a special exception process, which you can already do in the city. You would go to the zoning examiner, plead your case in a court setting, and then you would be able to get a special exception based on some findings from the zoning examiner. It's just another process. So we realize that this won't fit all sites. Every site's a little bit different. It's really hard to account for all the different site conditions for parcels around the city. So they're processed in the same way that they're currently processed. You go through, submit your application, go through a zoning examiner hearing, and do your public meetings and everything. So there are more ways than one to opt into the corridors tool. Like I said earlier, this is kind of a protection for these really large sites. So this is an example of the Park Place Mall. A master plan is required for all sites 12 acres or larger, and think big mall sites, really big strip mall sites. And then neighborhood meetings are going to be required, design reviews required. I don't know if anyone has a lot of history with how Elcon was developed, but this is to protect neighbors when it comes to large developments like this being redeveloped. So a master plan site would have to be approved by a design review. It would have to be explored through neighborhood meetings with the immediate neighbors. And that goes for all things 7 stories and above or 12 acres or larger. So they built in some of those protections for these really large redevelopment potential sites. I really want to talk about the community benefits here because there's some give and take. So because I said, like I said earlier, we cannot require people to build affordable housing in the city of Tucson. That is a state mandate. That's not changing. This is to allow diverse housing types and create more housing choices. Right now, we're seeing a lot of the choices being very limited to large apartment complexes or single-family homes that have been being built on the outskirts of Tucson, kind of increasing sprawl in the city. What we're seeing is that we want to require transition in form and scale to lower density neighborhoods. So when we're walking along a corridor, it's not a very inviting scene a lot of the times in Tucson. You walk along Speedway, you see a sea of parking, and then maybe a building setback. The community corridors tool does not allow you to set your building back more than 30 feet. The idea is to have, as you can kind of see in this picture here, is have a corridor, have a landscape buffer, have a larger sidewalk than is required by code. Right now, you only need a 4-foot sidewalk by code. The community corridors tool requires you to have an 8-foot sidewalk to increase the pedestrian walkability of a neighborhood. It requires shade along that, and then it requires for the parking to be in the rear of the development as opposed to the front. I don't know about you, but if I'm walking to a grocery store, which first I cannot because there's none near me, which hopefully this will help address, it is your options are to either walk through a sea of asphalt or to walk a little bit further to get to a sidewalk that will actually lead you to a store that you want to get to. This encourages you to have your storefront closer to the road, closer to the sidewalk, to increase and closer to shade and different amenities, community amenities, to provide a better public space. We're seeking privacy mitigation. So that step back that I'm talking about. So instead of having a huge block, a huge apartment building just looking down into the neighborhood, we're looking for step backs. We're looking to right-size parking requirements. The city of Tucson parking requirements are pretty arbitrary and based on a code that is really no longer relevant. You see everywhere that there's underutilized parking areas. What we're looking for with parking is that parking statements instead of actual arbitrary parking requirements are required for every developer that's proposing less parking than is required by code. So you'll see often like large retail areas, think Elcon Mall, will have way more parking than they need because it was required by code. So we're looking to right-size our parking by having developers provide us parking statements, showing us where they are in relation to transit, showing us how much parking they actually need. And so we're making it a much more involved process than just slapping arbitrary parking requirements on people. And then creating safe, comfortable streets for walking and biking. Not all of our streets, and in fact, it's a pretty, the city has a problem that they need to deal with pedestrian deaths. And so we're trying to make it more walkable and more bikeable. Creating active and usable public spaces, encourage climate resiliency and livability. And then we're also finding with all the sister city studies that we've seen, and we've also seen in the city of Tucson, the more dense development you get along your corridors, the broader the tax base becomes for that area. And then the maintenance and infrastructure and community services are much easier to provide for when you have denser housing along corridors. And kind of less important in this part of the process, but so this is a lot has not changed here in the city where when it comes to development, you start with your pre-application, which is required for a community corridors tool. That's where you can kind of hash out some of your parking studies, some of your parking statements and everything. You do your neighborhood notification. This was something that was thrown in last minute by the mayor and council. As part of the adoption, mayor and council required that surrounding property owners within 400 feet of all neighborhood associations within 1 mile of a project will be notified when a project is applied for. So that kind of gives you a little bit more information about what's being built near your neighborhood. And then they would proceed as regularly the development package, which is the application for all commercial projects, and then building permits. So now you can follow this process along if there's something that goes up in your neighborhood, and you can follow the process from beginning to end and see what's being built in your neighborhood. I do want to shamelessly plug one thing before I end my presentation. Plan Tucson is a really big part of what we're doing right now in our department. This is a required state general plan update for every 10 years, and that 10 years is up. And so Plan Tucson is really in that stage 4, that final stage of where we're doing voter outreach and voter education. And I'm happy to come talk to you all again a little bit more in depth about this too, if you'd like, or send you some more information. But the Plan Tucson team in the city of Tucson is going to be doing a lot of voter outreach and voter education because this will be on the ballot in November. We just got the go-ahead from mayor and council to put this on the ballot. And so people are going to see that when they get their ballots, and Plan Tucson is going to be up. So you can If you'd like, you can scan this QR code and you can see what the draft of Plan Tucson looks like, and you can kind of follow through how the process is going, what's next. Any community events you'd like the Plan Tucson team to come speak at, we'd really love to do that. We've probably talked to 8,000 to 10,000 different people about Plan Tucson over this process. We'd love it to be more. And so I don't want to take up too much time with Plan Tucson, but I thought I would plug that while I'm here.
Question regarding the parking. You indicated that there will be parking requirements, etc., and you may have to walk a little bit in order to get to your destination. What about handicapped parking availability? And then if you're in a wheelchair, for example, and access in some of these high density areas?
Yeah, thank you, Allison. That's a really good question. The one thing that the community corridors tool cannot waive is ADA requirements. So in fact, it builds upon ADA in the sense that you used to be able to only have 4-foot sidewalks, and you see that around the city everywhere. You now have to have 8-foot sidewalks, and you have to comply with ADA 100%. And so no matter what the parking ends up being, they still have to do the building code ratio for ADA accessible parking. So that is one thing that won't change at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about bike paths. It doesn't seem to me that you're making any allowance for bike paths. What we currently have in Tucson are not terribly safe when you're just basically out in traffic. And studies show that women are much less likely to bike with the kind of bike path system we have. So is any planning for better bike paths involved in this?
Thanks, Lillian. That's a great question. And this is something that we did talk about in the outreach stage. And so this was a balancing act because we took what we heard from developers, we took what we heard from mayor and council, and we took what we heard from the neighborhoods. And so we started pretty broadly. One of the ideas was to make protected bike paths along some of these corridors. That's not something that ended up making it in the final draft just because of different requirements that kind of got dwindled out. But this is also in conjunction with other city plans. So right now, the Department of Transportation is updating their major streets and routes, and that's going to be up at Planning Commission here in the coming few weeks. I'll get the exact dates if you'd like. But that part of the process and that part of the plan is a little bit more appropriate for when they're going to be studying these major streets and routes. So I would encourage you all to be very present in that part of the conversation. The community corridors tool is mostly designed to affect private property or public property that's owned by, that's within a parcel. So like an area of buildings. So the major streets and routes or streets designs was a little bit out of our purview when it came to the community corridors tool. So it's a really good idea. It's something that we wanted to incorporate. It's just something that did not really make it into that final draft. But we are encouraging people in larger developments to increase bike parking. And in fact, part of the parking statement and the parking study that's required for every developer here is to show us how bike parking can be accommodated and how better bike infrastructure can be integrated. When it comes to the actual bike paths in the streets, that was just a little bit outside of the purview of the community corridors tool. But I'm happy to follow up with you about some of the changes to the major streets and routes, which that would be a little bit more in that wheelhouse.
I would like to know if you're going to be considering or will be insisting on electric vehicle charging stations for the buildings, the new buildings that are going up.
Thanks, Barbara. So this does not eliminate the requirement, and this is something that's fairly recent in the city of Tucson. This does not change any of the requirement for the ratio of electric vehicle charging stations you would need for the parking. So let's just say you had a requirement of 100 parking spaces for your development. Depending on what the use was there, you would need about 10 or 15% of those to be electric vehicle spaces. Let's say someone opts into the community corridors tool and does 80 parking spaces based off of the findings of the neighborhood. they would still be required that same ratio of electric vehicle parking spaces. So that's not changing. But EV charging spaces are something that we're going to be constantly re-reviewing as time goes on. So I think we're going to keep reviewing it here in about a year and a half. So those aren't changing, and we are still requiring that to be a part of your development package.
That's good news.
Thank you.
Andrea wanted to know how the city would prevent building of guest houses that owners make into Airbnbs. I don't know that it would, because it's really, this is a corridor tool, not necessarily a neighborhood tool. And she follows up with how to prevent building apartment complexes right on top of single family home neighborhoods. And I think you've addressed that with a step back, but if you have anything that you want to add, go right ahead and answer those questions.
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. And you're right, Michael. So this really wouldn't touch Airbnbs. I think we're going to be talking about that a little bit more when we do our middle housing study here coming up pretty soon. If you all want to stay tuned to that, we're going to be at the mayor and council here next month, and then we're going to be studying that all summer. Airbnbs are tough too because it's regulated by the state, and the city really can't do anything about that. What we have found, though, is once you reach a certain point in housing construction and development, and you hit a certain vacancy rate in the city, then you kind of start relaxing some of those concerns about Airbnbs. So we're just not building enough housing right now, and this is what that's really aimed at. Once we start building enough housing, that's when that concern about the Airbnbs really becomes much, much smaller, because you have enough in the market for people to buy or rent. So corridors isn't really going to touch Airbnbs much, because this is more about multifamily housing instead of those single family housing. But please stay tuned to the middle housing, and I can send you everything we have on that if you'd like, because that's going to be a little bit more relevant for that. But also in terms of building apartment complexes, this is solely meant to be along corridors. So like Michael said, stepping back so that the tallest part of the building is only toward the major streets, and then stepping your building down so that the smallest part of the building is only closer to the neighborhood. And then some other privacy mitigation concerns we put into the code that were requiring people to do privacy mitigation for the neighborhood. So that was kind of our balance for protecting neighborhoods, but also making sure we're building enough housing for this to be worth it.
And that leads into Mr. Benson's question. He says, are the new heightened building heights allowed to diminish the views of the mountains from older established neighborhoods?
So part of this, two of the things that we did here was, one, we are not allowing the community corridors tool to be built along scenic corridors. So if you are along a scenic corridor or a environmental resource zone corridor, this community corridors tool is not allowed. So those are kind of those, and I can send you some maps if you'd like of where those are, but those are kind of those studied corridors where the scenic views are kind of that cultural hub of those mountain views. So they're not allowed along those. We didn't make the height extreme just to protect some of those view sheds, but if you're not in one of those, you can get to those building heights. So this is still only designed to be 4 to 6 stories, maybe 7 at the max in some of those really rare zones. So it's not going to be one of those things where you see downtown style buildings on every block. This is more of those 4 to 6. And I will say along those corridors already, you can already do 2 or 3 stories. So this is just upping it a couple stories.
Can neighborhoods still veto a project?
So neighborhoods, the involvement of the neighborhood is limited to the notification. Where neighborhoods will, neighborhood members will get a say is in those large master plan communities. So think about the Elcon Mall site or the mall sites, and think about sites where buildings are going to be 7 stories or greater. So that's where the neighborhood meetings will be held, and that's where neighborhoods will be able to get their involvement. The others are purely informational.
So my question is there, are there any citing of utilities restrictions, like utilities need to be buried or underground?
Thanks, Jackie. Good question. So there is no requirement for undergrounding utilities. And in fact, most of Tucson, there's no requirement for that. So we did not add a requirement for that. I will say that all utilities, every permitting process has still stayed the exact same. So if you're developing a large site, even last year, let's say, regardless of the community corridors tool, you still had to show that you had enough water, you still had to show drainage, you still had to show that you had electrical upgrades that needed to be done, you needed to update piping, wastewater projections. All of that is still staying the same. Just because you can build more housing now doesn't mean that you can build it to a substandard. So everything else, we're only changing a very small section of the zoning code. So we're not changing anything undergrounding wise, but we are still requiring every other requirement that has still been in the codes to be fulfilled, essentially.
It horrifies me a little bit that these apartment buildings are going to be built right on the street because traffic fumes are not safe, they're dangerous, they're unhealthy. And so because there's no setback from the road, apartments, are going to get a lot of the fumes from cars. When I'm downtown, there's some really kind of cute looking apartments that are right downtown, and they are right on the street. And that's what I always think about, is this may not be the safest place to live. There are all kinds of health problems that increase if you're in an area where there's a lot of traffic.
Thanks, Lillian. That's a good point.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Was that considered?
So yeah, so it was considered in a couple of different ways. So one, there still needs to be that buffer zone. There's still a requirement for a landscape buffer zone to be between the street and the building. And so we've upped that requirement a little bit so that there's a barrier of trees and plants and vegetation even between the sidewalk and the street. We're also saying that we need those sidewalks to be 8 feet. So between the 10-foot landscape buffer, the 8-foot sidewalk buffer, and then the building, we're still going to have the building set back a little bit more. We also kind of address that concern through what we're seeing in our parking lots anyway. Most of these buildings and most of these construction projects are already having really high thoroughfare with cars going up to the building. They just happen to be in the form of parking lots where more people are idling cars or more people are coming in and out. So they are closer to the street, but with some of those community amenities like wider sidewalks and more landscaping requirements, we're hoping that those are mitigated.
Did anybody actually do any measurements to see if that mitigated anything or how much it reduced it?
In terms of like environmental impact or like air quality?
In terms of the auto fumes?
Not that I'm aware of in the city of Tucson. No, so this was mostly something that was making zoning a little bit more flexible where it was inflexible before. So the city of Tucson did not do a parking or a vehicle fume study on this. This is less a single project rather than some flexibility in our zoning code for people to be able to build more housing units. So we have a couple of pre-application conferences that developers have asked to participate in. So I imagine you'll start seeing projects over the next year. I wouldn't expect to see anything within the next 6 to 9 months. It usually takes a little bit longer than that for the development of larger sites like that. We have seen some interest. We've talked to several developers that are looking at utilizing this. So I wouldn't expect to see a lot. And in fact, a lot of these sites are already kind of built out. So I don't anticipate that you're going to see large swaths of buildings being built along corridors. This is just something that through years of studying and years of planning, we've just seen that there's a lot of barriers in our zoning code. We're trying to remove some of those barriers to get a better product out there. There's a chance that there's a few buildings, there's a chance that there's more than that. It's really hard to say, but we really wanted to provide that flexibility for that to be able to happen because the zoning code is one of the barriers to building affordable housing in the city. There's a lot more barriers too. The price of building materials, the lack of vacant land, things that the city really does not have a lot of control over. We do have control over how flexible we can be with our zoning code that was built for a more suburban Tucson, that was written for a more suburban Tucson. we've grown a lot over the past 20, 30 years. Our zoning code has not kept up with growth. So really we've seen that we needed to make some changes to zoning in order to make some of those differences in our housing units and how many housing units are being built. So there's a chance that this will be something that will be utilized a lot, and there's a chance that it won't. And we're just going to have to wait and see. I will tell you that over the next 2 years, this is something that we're going to be keeping track of and reporting back to our mayor and our city council about. So stay tuned with this, because we're going to be keeping a lot of those metrics about what this has done, and we're going to be looking at how effective it was, what changes we need to make. Were they negative? Were they positive? So this is something that's going to be constantly monitored. So I'd stay in touch, and I'll give you my contact info here. I'm happy to stay in touch with you. This is something that's going to be constantly evolving.
Mr. Benson would like to know if commercial parking areas will be required to cover with solar collectors.
No, so that's a good question, and we did get that question come up quite a bit. So right now there is very little in terms of our zoning code of how much you can or requirements to do solar. Where we do encourage solar is some of our shade requirements for the community corridors tool. So you do need a certain amount of shade in some of these developments that that a developer would do. And so some of that shade can come in canopy trees, and then some of it can come in the form of solar projects. So we do encourage it, but this is not something that's going to be required. Something that gets really complicated when we require solar to be built on so much, and we had to find a balance between developer and homeowner and what will actually get built. So we did not have any solar requirements more than our regular code has solar requirements.
I'd ask you to turn to state housing bills. You said you've been tracking some of them, and I was wondering if you could give us a breakdown of what we might be expecting to actually be seeing in terms of changes to state housing rules in the current session.
Yeah, so House Bill 2721 was just passed by the state last year. That will require all cities of 75,000 people or more to allow for middle housing, which is defined as duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, to be built within allow them to be built within 1 mile of the central business district, and to allow for 20% of all subdivision housing to allow for these middle housing. So what that means is the city gets to define, or we part of our process of outreach is to define what that is going to look like. So right now we do have a central business district, which is more or less the downtown area. So right now the state is going to require us for every parcel within that mile radius to allow for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. I'll say right now at this point in time, that doesn't change a lot of what can be built in those areas already. Because you see a lot of the smaller neighborhoods, some of the older neighborhoods, where you can already have a duplex or a triplex. So right now, we just went, last week, we went to a mayor and council to initiate the study for this, and you'll be hearing from us very shortly about kind of our plan for outreach. This needs to be implemented by January 1st, so we're going to hit the ground running pretty quickly. Part 2 of that is any new subdivision of 10 acres or more. So think Southeast Tucson, where you have you get some of these large pieces of land where you can build single family residential. Developers would also have to leave 20% of that land to be developed, or to allow for that land to be developed with duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. My initial thought on that is you can already kind of do that in most of the city right now because of our ADU bills. I don't personally think this is going to change a lot in the city, but it is going to be an interesting case study on how we look at our central business district and whether the people of Tucson want to expand that opportunity for more people to do ADUs in their yard. You can already do most of it right now. You can already do most lots in the city. You can already do 2 more ADUs. So this bill would allow you to do 1 more if you're in that zone. So that's something to keep an eye on. We're going to be going to neighborhood associations. We're going to be reaching out to the public. And feel free to send me an email or send me a text. That's my work cell, and get updates on that. I'm happy to talk about that. So the state's also kind of toyed with the idea of the starter home bill. And so we'll see what they end up doing with that. I'm not sure that that's going to happen or not, but the big one right now is going to be that middle housing requirement. So because that has to be done by January, or it has to be citywide, and that would just affect every single parcel.
Okay. Salila asks thoughts on SB 1229. The city of Tucson signed in against it on RTS. I'm not familiar with the bill myself. Could you give us an idea of what that is, and if you have any thoughts about it?
So yes, this is something that the state is looking at, and this is something that we're meeting with them about. This would essentially allow for what smaller minimum lot sizes, would not allow us to do greater setbacks. We have some questions about this, especially as it relates to subdivisions. So think like the again, like that southeast side of Tucson where you have a lot of those subdivisions. There's some interesting things in here. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. There will definitely be some things in this bill that we have a lot of questions about because the way it's written would be a very difficult thing to amend our code to. So I'm curious to see how far this one goes, but we definitely have this one on the radar. We've been meeting with the state about it. And we have a couple other meetings with them where we're asking questions, especially, and this helps us because some of these are not written in a way that really address a current zoning code. So you'll see a lot of these are written in a way it's kind of a wish list of things. They're not always written in a way that kind of jive or mesh with zoning code. So we do have a lot of questions about this one. Stay tuned because if this one gains more traction, then we're going to have to look at this one as well.
Hey everybody, it's Senator Martell. As all of you know, Arizona Democrats have had a lot of important wins over the last few years. We won 2 U.S. Senate races, and we delivered Arizona's electoral votes to President Biden and Vice President Harris. We elected Governor Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State Adrian Fontes, and Attorney General Chris Mays. Now, those elections were close, and our victories mattered. Arizona Democrats from the federal to the local level have delivered real results for our state on critical issues like combating climate change, lowering prescription drug costs, protecting the right to vote, and preventing more restrictions on abortion access. The Democrats of Greater Tucson offers the opportunity to hear from elected officials and candidates about that important work and the issues that matter to them. That information will be invaluable as Arizonans head to the polls. So this election cycle, whether you're signing up to knock doors, make phone calls, or joining the Democrats of Greater Tucson to hear from and speak to Democrats in our area, please know that your voice matters and we need you on this team. Thank you.